Three, two, one. Miss Lorena, you can start.
Hello, everyone. Just a sec as I'm getting my PowerPoint on the screen. It's having some technical issues. Can everyone see the slides now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Great. Welcome everyone to session 1 of the webinar series on challenges, lessons, and innovations for integrated flood risk management. This is an event organized as part of the Asian Development Bank's Knowledge Support and Technical Assistance Project, Strengthening Integrated Flood Risk Management. I'm Lorena Ramirez, Senior Water Specialist for London Mills and the Project Manager, and I will be moderating today's session. Please note that this meeting is being recorded, therefore turn off your cameras if you wish. And please note for attendees from Vietnam and Indonesia, there are other language channels providing simultaneous interpretation to Bahasa and Vietnamese. This session will last for 90 minutes, and we will have a discussion section after the presentation. Please submit your questions during the session via the chat box, and we will compile them to go through them at the end during the discussion section. We will now start with opening remarks from the Asian Development Bank. I am pleased to introduce Manoj Sharma, who is the Chief of Urban Sector Group from the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department at the Asian Development Bank. With over 25 years of experience working with the bank and the government of India, Manoj has led multi-sector teams for designing and implementing complex and innovative projects for urban infrastructure and economic corridors development. Manoj has also supervised policy dialogues on reforms for industrial development, urban governance, including capacity building of urban local bodies, and infrastructure financing. Manoj, would you like to say some words, please?
Thank you, Lorena, Virinder, Jeff, and everyone. So greetings from Asian Development Bank, Manila. I'm absolutely delighted to be here for launching this webinar series on integrated flood risk management. First of all, let me extend a very warm welcome to all the participants. This is a joint initiative of ADB's several groups, Urban Sector Group, our FCDO or UK government supported trust fund called Urban Climate Change Resilience Trust Fund, and Water Sector Group. This collaboration itself signifies the importance of the topic, integrated flood risk management. All of us know it very well that Asia is highly susceptible to floods. The frequency of extreme weather events like repeated floods, storms affect people's lives in the most severe and detrimental manners. From ADB's Strategy 2030 point of view, I would like to highlight that one of the key priorities for us is providing integrated solutions to the increasingly complex problems in our developing member countries. We at ADB recognize that improving environment, climate resilience, and disaster risk management of our member countries is quite critical. I'm happy to share that increasingly our investments are prioritizing interventions to build resilience and provide these integrated solutions, including in flood risk management. And this makes this series of webinars highly timely and critical and useful, relevant. As all of us know, IFRM or Integrated Flood Risk Management takes a risk-informed, holistic decision-making process, and it covers both structural and non-structural measures. But most importantly, this is about strong governance and prudent financing. And we'll hear more about these approaches in these 5 webinar sessions. Let me take this opportunity to also thank Government of UK for their support to Urban Climate Change Resilience Trust Fund, which has supported these interventions for the last 8 years and also committed to supporting further in the next 7 years. So finally, let me wish a very successful workshop and webinar series and look forward to the constructive discussions from all the participants and speakers. Thank you very much, and back to you, Lorena.
Thank you, Manoj, for your words. Thank you, Manoj, for your words. Next, I would like to introduce Ian Wood, the team leader and climate change specialist to the Knowledge Support and Technical Assistance Project on Integrated Flood Risk Management. Ian Wood has over 35 years of experience working in the water resources and flood management sectors, and over half of this experience has been in Southeast Asia. Through working on projects with donor agencies, Ian Wood can offer some insights on the many practical aspects for implementing flood risk and disaster management programs. Ian, would you like to provide an introduction on the project and the webinar series, please?
Lorena, welcome to everyone. So this is the first of 5 seminars, webinars that we'll be providing under this TA 9634 for strengthening integrated flood risk management. The overall TA project, we commenced in February of 2019, and the project concludes later this year in June. Just to explain who we are, so at the top of the slide is the logos for Landell Mills and JBA. So we're the partnership of UK firms that are implementing the project on behalf of ADB. And then the funding itself comes from the Urban Climate Change Resilience Trust Fund, which is a ADB managed administered trust fund, which receives funding support from the Rockefeller Foundation, from the government of Switzerland, as well as the government of UK as well. So the overall objective for the TA has been to strengthen the design and implementation of IFRM solutions, enhancing knowledge and application of IFRM strategies. And the focus of the work in the TA has been 8 countries. And these 8 countries are specific to the trust fund arrangements. And so these are Indonesia, Philippines, Vietnam, Myanmar, Bangladesh, India, Nepal, and Pakistan. So during the course of the TA, we've conducted a number of activities, some specific, actual implementation of specific investigations or analysis or specific support for the different countries. And some of the work has been a bit more general, of kind of general knowledge, knowledge products and knowledge tools as well. So if we can go to the next slide, Lorena. So just as I mentioned, this webinar series contains 5. So starting this week, we're looking at a sort of top-down country level and regional level view across the countrywide. The second seminar next week is more at a lower level. We're looking at more a river basin approach, looking at how to apply IFRM principles and solutions. The third one is further down into the detail a bit more, looking at specifically coastal flood risk assessment based on some specific examples that we've conducted in the project. And the fourth one is perhaps more general, again, looking at economic and finance issues for IFRM. And the fifth one on April 5 was, we've left a bit open, and we really wanted to take this opportunity to kind of generalize and reflect on the whole process that we've followed. And so we've called this an outlook on IFRM and ways forward. And so the discussion will focus on that. The objective for the webinar series is really to share our experiences from implementing the project and reflect on issues and lessons learned for applying IFRM in some practical applications. So with that, I'd like to hand back to Lorena, and we'll get into the technical aspects of this presentation.
Thank you, Ian, for your introduction. Now I will go into introducing the first speaker of the session. The first speaker is Dr. Tony Green, who has over 35 years of experience in all forms of flood risk management. For the past 10 years, much of Tony's focus has been Asia and other developing countries, where he has used his extensive flood risk and geomorphology experience to lead a wide range of integrated flood risk management and nature-based solution studies. This has included extensive work for the Mekong River Commission, where he has acted as a chief technical advisor on climate change and adaptation. Tony, looking forward to hearing about the benchmarking assessments on flood risk. I think you are on mute, Tony.
Unmute. So we have a little poll. Could we launch that? Or I just get my slides working as well?
Patagonia colleagues, could we please launch the first post question?
So before we get going, we're just trying to use a little bit of interaction. I see one or two things in the chat already about spending on drainage or something. So my question is just to set us in the right direction is as a fraction of gross domestic product, how much should the sort of middle income Asian country be investing in flood risk management every year? What do you think? If you haven't done one of these, I think you can just simply click in in whichever category you want to have. And but hosts cannot vote, so I cannot show you some. But if you place your vote in here, then we can share the results in a minute. So I'll leave that up for a moment while I just introduce what I'm going to talk about today. So we've been doing, as part of the project, a little bit of work on the view of flood as a sector, considering the different aspects of integrated flood risk management and how they are being managed in each country. What are the challenges and what are the sort of current status? And obviously one thing is about the flood infrastructure, but there are other aspects, including things like the disaster response and preparedness, the flood warning, some use of NBS systems, catchment protection, etc. So there's many different things, but if we could just concentrate for a minute on some of the infrastructure issues. What I'm going to show you is some results from using a global flood mapping, how that can inform some of these questions about how we need to sort of look at where the expenditure can be most effectively targeted. And then Dr. Barry Hankin will talk afterwards about looking in an individual country. So could we show the results of the poll? I don't have control of that. So we have people suggesting, as I'm saying, what we should be doing and which may not be what we are doing. I'll present 1 or 2 figures on what we are doing at the moment. So the flood sector often gets a lot of attention. The poll shows that sort of the people working in the flood sector, obviously the largest number think we should be spending a bit more, 35%, spending more than 1% GDP, not sort of unreasonable amount when we consider that our total infrastructure spending requirements been estimated by various people around 4.5%, 5% in total. But I'll present to you some things about flood as a sector, what the sort of numbers seem to be showing. But so we have obviously a range there. Some people thinking 0.05% of GDP, 0.1% of GDP, and so on. It's all valid opinions, and obviously countries will vary. Can we close the poll now? And I'll start the presentation. Here we're looking at just a typical flood where I happen to be living in Cambodia. And you can see obviously there's the rural side, there's the built up side, there's the transport side, and all those things are going on in a flood. Next. All right. If we look at the SIGF assessment report just out from IPCC, there's no surprise to us that floods feature very predominantly in the expected impacts. And they pick out a number of key cities here, Jakarta, Ho Chi Minh City in two of our target countries. And we have Dhaka also, all of those featuring very strongly on flood being one of the key impacts that we expect, and the adaptation options. How is the progress on some of those? Obviously still in sort of yet to come to fruition really, but some work are going on. But so the floods aspect linking closely with the expectations on climate change, and our sort of area in Asia particularly being one of the ones that are being highlighted here as being impacted and needing to consider closely the adaptation options. So in flood risk management, we're looking at a lot of change. We've got that climate change aspect, but we've also got other changes, including the expectations of people. Most countries are moving towards a higher level of development. So expectations and what's at risk is actually increasing all the time. We sometimes call that capital stock as well. So all that investment that's been going into both rural and urban areas, and less tolerance. People often think that the flood problem must have been solved already because the transport, the roads are so much better, transport systems are so much better, the water supply may be so much better, but floods often sort of seem to get left behind somehow. And then when a flood comes, people are very much not happy. Insurance plays a role in that residual risk, but the planning is a thing that we can see really that in the longer term is a key part of that integrated approach. If we consider flood as a sector, as I say, we're not only talking about the infrastructure, but we're talking about the flood risk management as a whole. But if we look at the sectors that we have in a typical planning document, such as this ADB's one of 2017, Meeting Asia's Infrastructure Needs, we see very big sectors of power, transport, telecommunications, and then a small one for water, sanitation. And flood doesn't actually appear as a sector at all. It appears just as a small part of water. If we look at some of those estimates on the changes in climate change, and changes in investment needs for climate change, in transport sector, one of the largest, the change in climate change requirements, change in investment for climate change, we see around $550 billion in Asia on this, these estimates. And that's just that change is almost the same as the whole of the water sector. And the flood sector is probably only 1/10 of the water sector. So although there's a lot of investment required, a lot of adaptation required to climate change, us in the flood sector, we're just a little part of that. But we are in getting better at some things, particularly at responding to floods and preparing for them, and particularly in a sort of a disaster management context, which may not be the same as the agency that's managing the infrastructure for floods, but it's all part of our flood risk management as a whole and should be rather seen and coordinated as such. If we look at the number of deaths in particular, which the disaster risk management is particularly effective for, those have been going down over the time, and we see very much success on that side. But if we look on the other side of the coin, the economic losses keep going up. There's more and more at risk, and maybe our infrastructure is not keeping up with that increase in risk. If we look at water security, there's a recent publication by ADB, the Asian Water Development Outlook, and that looks at different sectors for national water security, and some of those include metrics for flooding, metrics for storms, for droughts as well, which is often in the water sector that we're dealing with. But very much we're still sort of just part of an overall investment picture. But when the flood comes, it really affects everything, and it doesn't necessarily confine itself to those distinctions that we make between our institutions of managing rivers, managing the cities, managing the catchments and the land, managing what happens at the coast, our weather services and how that's translated into flood forecasting, and how we are prepare and respond to disasters. All those things need very close integration. And in nearly every country, when a big flood comes, we see problems of that integration. So we can keep coming back to that sort of theme of integrated flood risk management and looking at the different parts of that. I hope that in this series we will get a chance for good discussions. We had some very good discussions maybe 2 years ago now, and we've been waiting to continue the discussion with. So I'm going to now describe some of the sector assessment work where we consider flood as a sector, and particularly about how some of the global flood mapping can inform us on some of these issues about how we should responding and integrating. So what we're doing is we're taking some global flood maps. This is done by the JBA Risk Management Group. So they're providing flood maps primarily to insurers, but also to other disaster risk management agencies. And those flood maps have also been provided to the ADB for the countries where we've been doing these studies. So we're taking that flood risk maps, and those have been derived in a fairly complex manner of looking at different storms and trying to get the best information they can on the previous flooding, also on the defences, and then we're combining that with information on the location of populations, and we're doing some statistics to look at what the exposure is and how many people are actually in those areas. So I'm going to present that to you in a moment. Dr. Barry will come back to the sort of the damaging side of things, which I'm not going to cover here. But obviously, that flood mapping is also highly relevant to that. If we consider a natural floodplain, often rivers, particularly the major rivers of Asia, are obviously highly modified, and we already have some infrastructure in there. If we think about if the flood came and that infrastructure was not affecting the location of the flood, the flow of the flood into different areas, what would the natural floodplain look like? And that's a very useful metric, in fact, for considering we know that banks can fail. We know that there's always a residual risk, whatever we do with our banks, however high we build them, even if we build them for 10,000 a year return period, there's always a risk of flooding still. So how many people are actually exposed? And then we can see later how many people are being protected. If we consider some of the more exposed countries, if we consider Bangladesh, we know Bangladesh is at the tail end of some major rivers of the Ganges, Jamuna, Meghna, and very much is a floodplain delta area. And if we look at sort of 100-year natural flood there, up to 45% of the landmass is potentially in the natural floodplain. If we look at even more extreme floods, we see even more of the total landmass in the potentially could be flooded. And now we're seeing some of the climate change things that go on. We need to think even past the 100-year, and that 1500-year is one that we can say is more extreme, that people still have a risk even out at that sort of level. For a more sort of island nation such as Indonesia, that will be lower, so maybe only 15%, and going up in that extreme flood to around 23%. So that's a big difference between just a 100-year flood and an extreme flood. So even if we have very good infrastructure that was as good as a 100-year level of protection, there'd still be a lot of people that's potentially exposed if an even more extreme flood comes along. And Pakistan, obviously in between those two, Philippines having quite significant number, but obviously smaller again, being not having so many major rivers. Vietnam being a bit higher, again having the major rivers of the Red River and the Mekong, as well as a number of smaller rivers exposed in the central part. If we look at the people living in those floodplains, so again taking that same floodplain mapping and overlaying it with the number of people, without considering the defences, there's a lot of people that are at risk, and some of those we are actually defending with some infrastructure. We may be also defending in terms of having flood forecasting and evacuation routes and so on. We may be managing the risk for them. But there's a lot of people living in the floodplains. Bangladesh, sort of around half the population. Indonesia, still a significant number of people in floodplains when you consider the extreme event. And Philippines, similarly. So clearly there's a lot of people potentially at risk, and the flood risk management is important for them. And these sorts of metrics help us to really quantify the issue. If we try and move on to defences, again, we have some the best estimates that could be assembled on a sort of at least regional basis for the defences that exist already. Then we look at how much of those areas that are at risk are actually protected with greater than 50 year. Then we see the areas, maybe I would guess that you would say that they were a higher proportion than we're seeing here of Vietnam, one of the best, 13%. Nepal not really having that much at risk, being a very mountainous country, but still a large number at being protected. And if we look at even higher levels of flood protection, then we see a number of people that are actually protected. Obviously goes down further. So we have total protected areas, we have a total number of people protected, and the proportion is around 40% of those at risk at a 100-year event being protected to at least a 50-year return period. Those mapping are about the river floods. So I also try and make some estimates of coastal floods, which if you look in the IPCC is also highlighted as a particular issue because they have not only the increase in rainfall driving higher river levels, but obviously the sea level also. And again, Bangladesh features very highly in that. Philippines and in Vietnam also. Nepal obviously not really. And in Pakistan, there's not a huge number, but the number that there are still a large part of those are at risk without defences. So our flood infrastructure, as I say, is one part of the flood risk management. But even within that infrastructure, we've got different parts. We've got our hard defences like river embankments, flood channels, floodways. We've got urban management, storm drains, storages, pump stations, etc. within the urban context. And then we have all those soft measures like flood warning systems, dissemination, planning for actually not or minimizing the number of people that are at risk, land management, and more recently, the sort of river protection, catchment restoration, nature-based solutions, and even some river works to try and reduce the risk of flooding and allow the river to behave and to maintain its flood within a certain part of the floodplain. So I'm going to come back to those things that we were looking at early on, where we had our little poll about what should we actually be spending on some of these things. And I present these data really as a fact that an indication rather than saying these are the exact numbers, because it's very actually surprisingly difficult to compile the amount of expenditure that's going into flood infrastructure because it's being managed by different agencies and the flood risk as a whole is quite a large and diverse area of expenditure. The other aspect, obviously, is that it varies. Sometimes when there's a big flood, there's a lot of work goes in, and then there's a lot of work goes on, and then it becomes less of a priority and it goes down. So this is data from a JICA research paper, Bridging Gaps on Infrastructure Investment in Asia, and they went round to these countries as well as some others, and looked at what's the expenditure on flood infrastructure and how I present here how that compares with the GDP, which was our first question to you. I think a number of people thought it should be more than 0.5%. So none of these countries make it to 0.5%, with the Philippines being one of the higher ones, and some of them being, I think in the particular time that this was taken, and Bangladesh and Pakistan were probably at a lower level than they are on average, because I've certainly visited both those countries and expected to see them higher. But anyway, this is what the figures that were found in the JICA study. But what's surprising really is that the expenditure relative to GDP currently is relatively low. The expenditure relative to the annual average loss, which is a bit more appropriate seemingly in the Philippines, in India, Indonesia a little bit higher than the others, and Bangladesh and Pakistan showing low. But as I say, I'm sure that they'll have some other programs coming along, particularly the Delta Plan in Bangladesh I'm aware of, and in Vietnam. In between the two, we're probably looking to increase its capital expenditure on flood at the moment with some ADB projects we're aware of. So I think interesting figures in terms of how we would actually, where are we? So that's what we're trying to show in this flood sector part. But we are also trying to look at the nature-based solutions, measures, and how well they're applied. And really my question, I hope we have some chances for discussion later, is, are we getting this balance right? We know there's many demands on the government expenditure, but in flood infrastructure, are we getting the balance right? So our sector assessment produces some of these tables. I'm trying to illustrate relatively how a country's positioned for different aspects: the population defended, the application of nature-based solutions, capital expenditure, using storages, using flood warning, flood monitoring, and how do those actually scope up. So that publication should be available soon. But really what I'm trying to highlight here is the use of some of those global data sets that are detailed enough regionally to give us some good indications of the level of risk and the level really of the challenge ahead of us. So that's my part of the talk, and we're going to move towards a national prioritization with Barry, and he's going to show us some new tools. But I think we would just like to launch the second poll if we could before Barry starts and while we change over. But I look forward to some discussions at the end of this session. I hope we've provoked a few things there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tony. Please, could we launch the second poll question? We have this question on the screen. I will start introducing the next speaker, which is Dr. Barry Hanking. Dr. Barry Hanking specializes in integrated modeling across urban green and nature-based solutions. He is an award-winning expert in modeling nature-based solutions and also a widely published co-investigator on the Nature Environment Research Council Nature-Based Solutions Research Program. Barry has led the development of the innovative National Integrated Risk Analytics tool for assessing national scale risk and prioritization of integrated flood risk management measures, including nature-based solutions.
Okay, thanks very much, Lorena, and thanks, Tony, and everyone else. So yeah, my talk's going to try and tease apart some of those national and broad Southeast Asian statistics and look in a bit more detail at the distribution of risk. And then this NERA tool that we were asked to sort of understand the risk distribution across the national scale, first at in Nepal, and then in Indonesia and in Sindh province in Pakistan. It allows us to understand how that, if we implement some different measures for integrated flood risk management, how that risk is reduced and the trade-off between different measures. And I'll talk about that with respect to Indonesia, but I'll show some of the national scale analyses in later slides. So what is NERA? Will be the subject of the first bit. NERA at the national scale.
Barry, can I interrupt? Can we show before we move on, can we just show the result of this poll, just as a quick snapshot, and then, sorry, I will let you get back to it.
Yeah, sure.
So this is a request to Patagonia. Can we show these results? All right, so the questions were slightly provocative, but the answers are kind of fairly evenly mixed between a top-down process, a political obscure process, and a location of the last big flood. The point of this discussion, of this question, was just to focus our minds on the question of how should funding be allocated to a particular location within a country. So, which is where Barry's going into now. Sorry, Barry, to interrupt, but let you go.
No, it's all right. Okay, that gives me a chance to slow down a bit. So NERA is a tool that we devised to understand the distribution of risk, baseline risk at the national scale, and have a kind of bird's eye view. So here you can see a map of Indonesia with different basins color themed according to risk. And here we're talking about residential risk from surface water and fluvial flooding. So I'm going to talk a bit about how we compared it with other estimates of risk to get a bit of confidence in it. And then I'm going to explain some of the risk reduction scenarios that we modeled nationally in terms of IFRM, and how this tool allows you to experiment with different trade-offs between a mixture, for instance, of traditional defences, nature-based solutions, property level resilience, and so on. So it allows you to weigh up different trade-offs and understand how you could make at the kind of basin scale things more resilient. But then we're also going to zoom in after a few slides from Lorena on capacity building. So having demonstrated the tool to the Indonesian government, they were then interested in doing just what that poll question was about, in terms of, can we make a more objective approach to prioritizing budgets? So can we use NERA? But we weren't just interested in using this sort of WYSI tool to understand the distribution of risk. We also wanted to do it in a sort of capacity building approach. So we worked with some of the technical departments and we brought in some of the Indonesian data, and we worked together to build a prioritization scheme that involved not only what we'd learned from NERA, but also their local knowledge. So hopefully it gave you quite a balanced kind of solution. So the slide transition's a bit slow. Hang on a second. Okay, so NERA stands for National Integrated Risk Analytics, and we were initially asked to look in Nepal, and then we expanded and looked at the distribution across Indonesia. And then in Pakistan, although we did look at the risk across Pakistan, we focused in on Sindh province, and we also looked at coastal risk there. For Indonesia and Nepal, we just looked at surface water and fluvial risk. What data does NERA use? So it uses the risk data generated by JBA Fly software, which undertakes probabilistic risk calculations. And the important thing to note is that these are quite high resolution. So we're providing that, bird's eye view, but it's based on very small scale 30-meter resolution flood hazard data. So we have a big library against 6 probabilities that you can see there for surface water and fluvial flooding. We also have quite high resolution but we also use world pop 100-meter resolution population density. We use census data to understand the distribution of different exposure types. So in terms of what's the composition of different districts and administrative areas in terms of the type of buildings. And for each of those, we had vulnerability curves and essentially based on a sort of JRC approach. And we run thousands of simulations based on the global event set from JBA of spatially realistic storms. And then we analyze the damage distribution. So I'll show you a little bit about that. So the first step is that we have these observation points in the river network if it's fluvial, and we might look at the severity of those events. So you can see at the observation points here, there's a distribution of event severity with red being high, and we'll look at that for every event. For each event, we also look at the linked population. So we'll have disaggregated the population or the buildings to 100-meter. We'll have intersected those with the 30-meter resolution hazard data, and we'll look at what is the severity at those exposures. Then we'll tabulate the severity for every single event and look at the depth. So interpolating between the different return period depth goods that we have at every exposure. So that map's supposed to show you individual exposures. So for every event, we then know the depth, and then we'll use a vulnerability curve to using damage proportions to understand the losses. And then we'll do that for 10,000 events, and we'll look at the damage distribution. So we can look at, say, what's the annual average losses and so on. So what does it look like when we do that at the big scale? So here we're looking at the nationalities that we use the tool on. And the top left, we've got Indonesia, and we're looking at the basin scale with average annual losses for residential and defended on the left. And then in Nepal, and you can see what it does is it sort of helps you have a bird's eye view of where your risk is. And perhaps you already knew some of this, but we're going to drill in a bit more shortly. And then for Sindh province, we can see, you know, we have this dominated exposure in Karachi from, you can see the coastal risk on the bottom right. But we're going to tease apart some of this. And so NERA doesn't just look at the baseline risk distribution. It also, we've modeled lots of different resilience scenarios, and then we can bring those in different mixes. But before we do that, we like to check against other national risk estimates. So here we've got some comparisons with Global Flood Analyzer, Aqueduct. We've got some analyses of the risk data in the MDAC database. And we like to do this to sort of satisfy that we're in the right ballpark at the national scale. So you can see that we're using our bottom-up approach with very small, high-resolution data, and then we're coming to a similar solution that other people have come to, or through just looking at the historical data in MDAT. And you can see that we get a reasonable comparison across those, but these are available in the report to look at in more detail. And then what we can do is rank the different districts or basins or whatever administrative area that we're interested in. So you can see here we've got Nepal, Sindh province, and Indonesia. And for each of those, we might have different metrics. So you can see if we choose this bottom one on Indonesia, we've got the average annual losses, and we've got the average annual households at risk, because they might not necessarily coincide, and you can see the ranking is different, and the average annual number of people at risk. And we can give an overall score based on those rankings, and then we can sort of highlight that overall more balanced understanding of risk at the baseline. We can also explore what that means. So what we quite often do to reassure ourselves that we're talking about the right thing is we'll zoom into somewhere that's been predicted as high risk. So here we're in Jamshed town in Karachi, and you can see here indeed we've got a large number of people exposed to surface water risk. It is one of our higher risk areas, and you can see, you know, reports of flooding and so on. And we can also look at these metrics such as people count on average every year that are exposed to flooding, and you can confirm that. So you can build up a picture. Similarly in Jakarta, you can see here, you can see why there's such a big exposure. So we've overlaid one of the largest return period hazard grids with the population density. And you can also see over in Sumatra, you can see Padang, we've got a lot of fluvial exposure, and this is why it's been flagged up as being red in those original maps. Similarly in Nepal, you can see we did some basin scale ranking. So you can see that on this sort of inset map, Jalad came up as red, and so did Japa. And so if we zoom in, we can see, if we overlay the hazard data from our global flood map, we can see indeed there's quite a lot of exposure, and this is not surprising. And so we build up a kind of understanding of the baseline risk and whether we trust our model. But then what we want to do is to understand residual risk, having identified potential areas for integrated flood risk management. So what we did is nationally, we modeled new embankments or defences in suitable areas, property level resilience. So here we might modify the vulnerability curve that I spoke about. Flood warning, here we might adjust the maximum exposure for every property, and nature-based solutions. So we split that into three, and we talked about the volume available from floodplain reconnection, runoff interception through storage, or through riparian tree planting. For each of those, we have to conceptualize how we're going to adjust the risk equation. And then we map those potential areas. So we do that at the national scale. Then we adjust the risk calculation in our FLY software. And then we rerun the probabilistic calculation to understand how the risk changes. So just briefly for defended areas, what we might do is intercept the high population density in the 1 in 100 year areas in red, you can see on the map. We'll map those, and then we will give those a standard of protection, say of 1 in 100 years. And these are the more likely areas that we target with traditional defences in this instance. And we do that for each of the measures, and we rerun the risk calculation, and then we attribute it to the spatial data. So we can understand for every district, what's the baseline risk, but what also is the risk if we have those defences in place. Then what we do is with that spatial data, we host this in NERA. So this is a kind of screenshot of NERA. I've zoomed into a particular administrative area, district level in Indonesia. And you can see what we've got is different sliders on a control panel on the bottom left, and we can move these. And in this instance, I've just slid it a property level resilience across to 10. So essentially within that district, all of the sub-district areas have got those vulnerability curves changed in areas that we're targeting. So it might make a small difference, and you can see that. You can see a slight change in the average annual losses, and you can see a slight change over here in the tabulated average annual losses. So perhaps it doesn't add a lot in this district, and perhaps you need to slide some of these other sliders, bring in some flood warning or some defended areas, and then you can see how it, and the tool allows you to sort of make these trade-offs. So you can say, okay, I'm going to do a heavily defended scenario, but what's the equivalent of that if I do a mixed scenario? Similarly in Nepal, you can see here we've brought in some defended areas and some property level resilience, and you can see, and a mixture of nature-based solutions and flood warning. And you can see how that adjusts nationally, picture, but you can also select one of these, like, as I had done in the previous slide, and you can zoom in on the district scale risk and see how that's adjusted. So you can understand national strategies, and you can also regionalize it as well. So in Sindh province, we also looked at coastal risk, and the nature-based solution there was we looked at mangroves and did a whole set of scenarios with and without those. And there'll be further talks on that later in the series. And you can sort of see as we slide that in how the risk adjusts. So I'm going to just hand over briefly to Lorena again, because having devised this tool and applied it to Indonesia, having demonstrated it, the government was interested in using it to help use this consistent national picture and objectively prioritize budget allocation. So just over to Lorena briefly.
Thank you, Barry. Thank you. Great. Yes, once NERA tool was developed, we presented to the director of rivers and coasts in Indonesia. And the feedback was that this could be a really helpful tool to support them with the process of prioritizing flood risk investments by identifying the areas of high flood risk and help with the shortlisting of proposed investments based on the annual budget available. So, but NERA was only one piece of the puzzle. And what we did was co-developing a framework of prioritization that integrates NERA with the national GIS database that compiles the proposed flood risk management schemes, integrated also with national and local data sets. The process was also informed by an initial needs assessment and many consultation sessions, including a training program where we cover the range of tools and techniques for prioritization. The result was a methodology for annual screening of proposed investments, and I will pass it to Barry from here to give us a bit more detail on the prioritization method. But Barry, I would like to ask you, please, if we could run very quickly through this section because we are running a bit late. So if we could wrap it up in a couple of minutes, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah. Try and do it justice. So having sort of explained that we have been looking at national scale risk estimates based on a bottom-up approach, we then turn this upside down and we look back in at the details scale, and we chose to work with the technical department BTS in Benyamin Solo river basin. And yes, sure, we can prioritize those different districts within there using NERA and risk analysis and the risk reduction that we've understood. But what we wanted to do was overlay the scheme data that had been developed in the roadmap, which is another part of the commission. So what we did was we overlaid the data, the hazard data and the risk data, which you can see color theming on the top left, with the roadmap data. And we wanted to understand, we could just use the outputs from NERA to prioritize these schemes and, you know, job done. But that wasn't really what we wanted to do. We wanted to work to collaborate and understand the risk and why these schemes were already prioritized in the first place. And you can see when you zoom into a high risk area like this orange area, you can see that there is quite a lot of risk. Just looking at the 1 in 20 year flood, there was a lot of exposure. So can we also sort of look and tease apart in more detail the risk in these places based on this hazard data and the exposure data? So we developed a range of exercises. We looked at flood risk appraisal, we looked at different types of prioritization schemes, and we came up with a range of methods for prioritizing these schemes. So you can see the schemes as stars there in this district, sorry, in this river basin. And you can see also in the background that the districts have been color themed by their priority. Now, if we just use NERA, we might come up with a picture like this, the high risk based on surface water and fluvial risk, as I've mentioned. But having worked together and having sort of looked at the consultation outcomes, we understood the data sets that were being used for second opinions when the Indonesian government was doing risk analyses. we understood new data sets such as key services and hospital data which was available. So in the top right, you can see a kind of matrix that we started building up. So not only did we have the blue areas covered with NERA, but we also had information on risk from inner risk and also on other types of exposure, critical services, hospitals, and so on, in other data sets that were already there. So if we combine that information together and reprioritize, you can see that, for instance, this Pakistan area had higher exposure to tsunami and coastal risk, as well as the fluvial. So although it was ranked highly in NERA, it was even higher when we brought in these other factors, including hospitals at risk and so on. So that gave us a more rounded picture, a more balanced picture of where we might prioritize the schemes, the flood risk management schemes. So we looked at a range of ways of doing that, and we came up with a prioritization process which was fairly sort of democratic. You probably can't read any of this, so I'll zoom into some of these areas. So you can see on the top left, we brought in, for different flood sources, different types of data, some from NERA, some from the Indonesian government. For different receptors or exposures, we also had other data sets that we brought in, and these were intersected with our hazard data or within a risk, and we built up a more rounded picture. You can also understand, in terms of like the total budgets that were proposed for the schemes in the roadmap, if we dealt with, say, 3/4 of the total risk by looking at the top 25% or 50% of the administrative areas, then how much would that cost? And then so you could start trying to understand, well, what is my basin scale budget? And also perhaps you've already looked at the national NERA results to sort of come to an understanding of what it should be given a national budget. So you can adjust what percentage of those schemes that you might prioritize based on that analysis. Then you can use the NERA tool as well. So it was an iterative approach, you can just about read in the green here, of looking at different trade-offs between IFRM, bringing in different sort of mixed solutions and looking at how the risk changes. So is there availability for a lot of nature-based solutions? Well, no, there isn't, but actually in this area, we could use a lot more flood warning and that would bring the risk down. So sort of iteratively coming to the right kind of solutions in the right place. And then we can come up with this kind of overall prioritization. So the darker blue in this instance highlights areas where we might want to prioritize, and also it's overlaid with the stars, which are the schemes in the roadmap. Okay, so in summary, we started at the national scale. We developed these kind of national estimates of baseline risk, and then we also run some national IFRM scenarios, assuming uptake of those everywhere. And then we built a tool NERA that allows you to interactively introduce that increased resilience, and then allows you to play with trade-offs between the different types of measures. And in this instance, we looked at property level resilience, nature-based solutions, defences and flood warning. We were then asked to use it to help objectively prioritise schemes, and we tested it with a group of technical experts and came up with a more rounded, perhaps more balanced approach to prioritisation that was fairly objective. So the final prioritisation process included using NERA, but also brings in those other data and local knowledge. So I think that's the end of my talk, and back over to Lorena.
Thank you, Barry. If we could please pass to the next slide, we're gonna start with the discussion now. If you have any questions, please raise your hand. But first, we will start covering the questions in the chat box. Actually, Barry, we have another slide. If you could go to the next one, please. We have some suggested questions here to stimulate the discussion. But as I said, we will start with the chat box questions first. Great. We have a first question that says, how do we best transfer knowledge learned in one country in the region to another? Tony or Ian, would you like to answer that question, please?
And he's not jumping in, I'll jump in. So how do we transfer knowledge from one region to another? I mean, what have we done in this project? In this project, we've really looked at these global data set information. We've tried to take this bird's eye view across the 8 countries in our project area, and using whatever we could find from in terms of published information sourced locally, as well as these global data sets. And so from that, we've been able to really make this comparison across countries, and then also this comparison within the country as well. So how do we transfer it from one country to another? It depends on what we're talking about. But the point is, what we're really trying to say is that that these global data sets exist. They're becoming more common, but we've really tried to take it from this sort of what seems like a great idea and very interesting, take it from that down to something absolutely more practical and something that can be really applied. And so that's what this NERA tool does. And so we've done it as pilots effectively in these 3 locations that Barry was talking about. But it would, in theory, be possible to take that further and apply that tool and refine it further for other regions. So the question is, how do we transfer knowledge learned in one country to another? Well, we're saying that these data sets these global data sets exist, and so therefore it is possible then to by examining each country or each region specifically, we can transfer this knowledge.
Thank you, Ian. I hope that answered the question. I'll move to the next one from Claire Imbert. Is NERA a free software? Can we access those data? And from Anthony Sola as well, there is a related question on this. How widely is NERA software used in Southeast Asia? And also, is the assessment for NERA by the Asian Development Bank available for the public? Barry, please.
I think that's a difficult one. I think the analyses that we've done will be available, but then it would cost to generate the same information for another place. So yes, and that certainly could be done, but there's a cost involved with generating the risk data. And actually, in this instance, when we worked with the Indonesian government, we were able to pass on all of that spatial information with all of the risk attribution. So the outputs were shared, but in terms of the platform, that could be set up, but there's a cost behind that for another place.
Thank you, Barry. We have another question that says, does your work focus on real-time data acquisition systems databases for preparation of flood management plans? Barry, I think this relates to NERA.
Are we talking about perhaps an early warning system? Are we looking at perhaps the availability of real-time data as being one of the factors when we're sliding in the sort of flood warning? I don't quite follow the question, but yeah, I mean, sure, that would be a consideration. NERA allows you to sort of experiment with what-if scenarios. So it might be, actually there is going to be better flood warning coming, or it's in one of the pipeline schemes. So you could try and understand how much risk might be reduced as a result of that.
Thank you, Barry. We have a question from Dr. Lutfur Rahman, and he says, how can risk in Bangladesh be quantified, and what other methods are available? over to Ian and Tony.
You would like to answer this one?
Yeah, I can have a go. I mean, obviously, we're trying to quantify risks from floods, at least, from the fluvial side and from the coastal side, by looking at what is at risk, what's the probabilities of it being affected, and in Barry's case, where the NARA tool is being used, then actually quantifying that risk in terms of either people's lives or the damage to infrastructure and properties. So I think Bangladesh, although it has a high risk, there's not fundamentally a different approach needed. As long as we have the data sets, then Bangladesh at high risk, but still has those, can follow the same principle as you would do as described in the NARA tool. But it's just, you need to obviously consider the risks from different sources, not only from the big rivers, from the local rivers, from the rainfall, from the coastal side of things, and the really getting the full social picture of what's actually at risk in terms of the people and their livelihoods. So I think the Bangladesh would follow quite well the sort of methodologies we've been talking about. And on the aspect of how best to sort of share this knowledge, I mean, that's something that we hope that we're doing something towards with this series of seminars, and we have some further on. So we can try and explore that. Maybe the ADB would have some ideas also. And there's other organizations, obviously, like the UN organizations of trying to, what is really the best forum to use. Okay, thank you.
I'll just add, because of the pandemic, we also did a lot of online training material and generated, sort of exercises and modules and so on when we were working up that prioritization scheme. So in a sense, that's transferable.
Thank you, Barry and Tony. Next question is from Joey Bailey. NIRA looks fantastic. Can you please provide some specific examples in Indonesia where the NIRA findings influence a particular policy or investment programming by the government?
Well, we're not quite at that stage yet. So the prioritization process, although it's received well by the DRC, we don't know if that's the final sort of tool or approach that will be taken. So it might be refined slightly. It can, obviously, when we were looking in detail in Solo, I was surprised actually at how similar the outputs were in terms of understanding. So if we went back to one of the slides, if we went back to, I'm not sure I can show it, but I'll try this slide. So just here, if you read some of these scheme proposals, the roadmap, so this is their proposals for measures, said, oh, we need to do more detailed modeling here. And that's exactly what I would, NIRA would also sort of suggest based on the risk analysis, is that location where the complexity of the floodplain and the interaction with the exposure. So it would complement.
Thank you, Barry.
Could I perhaps add some to that as well? I mean, it goes back to this question that we started with for this Barry session was how do governments allocate priorities for investment? And it's a complex question, and the answer is often it's a political issue. And what we mean by that is that it's not just what happened in the last flood event, but it's the kind of people that suffered, and it's the kind of situation that had occurred. And it also relates to what can be done in some areas, in particular in a country. The problems are large and complex, and it's difficult to actually develop a simple solution to them. So I guess, so what I'm getting to is that NERA doesn't provide the answers. It's a tool which informs a process, but the other end of the process is not only just this information coming from NERA, but it's all of the other complex information that relate to what one might actually do when it comes to addressing a flood risk problem. NERA for me is a bit of the holy grail. So as someone working in flood management for a long time, you start with doing flood studies. 20 or 30 years ago, you do a flood study, you work out where the area is flooded, then you say, well, what does that tell us? And you need to integrate that with something about what is in that area that's flooded. And it might be people or houses or something else that's of value, and making some estimate of that value, but then working out what needs to be done about that. And it's possible to do a flood study in a specific location and answer all those questions over a long period of time with a lot of intensity of effort. NERA is the tool that does this, not just in one specific area, not one river, but across a whole region or a whole country even. So it's a tool, it's broad brush, it's a high level, but it's certainly, what we've found is that it can really does relate to reality, and really focus the attention on the areas that perhaps should be focused upon, and avoids this sort of other thing that tends to happen in flood management, is that it's the latest flood that gets all the attention. Oh, we had a big flood in Brisbane last week, or Sydney. That's where all the flood attention should go. So it helps us better take this bird's eye view and look down across a whole region and really look at priorities in terms of actual risk.
Thank you, Ian. We have another question from Firoj Alam. He's interested to know the dynamics of the risk in Indonesia shown in NERA. Is it increasing or decreasing because of the influences of other factors? Firoj, you could raise your hand as well if you would like to explain a bit more on that. Is that question clear for the speakers?
In terms of how does NERA look at changing risk, we have looked at some scenarios for future epochs in the Sindh coastal modelling, and it's not impossible to attach the equivalent risk data and allow someone to look at future epochs in the framework. We were just sort of tasked with looking at the present day, but in the prioritization process, we took into account changes because of climate change. So that's an example of where we had to go outside of what we'd done in NERA to bring in extra information. But it's not impossible to include it within the portal.
Thank you, Barry. There is another question on NERA as well, from Lita. Can NERA analyze and compare the integration realization of a flood control project in an area, like compare the difference of a flood condition before and after the project is implemented? I think this will help in the preparation of master plans, specifically in the regional level.
Well, I mean, yes, in the sense that you can say, okay, it depends how accurately the potential areas that we've mapped for, say, a new defence map onto the ones that are done in actuality. But because we've been, we've looked at the opportunities based on quite high resolution data. So it's likely that, we're introducing a standard of protection with a new scheme in the right place. And so long as that's right, you've then got the risk and the risk reduction for a given scenario. So typically it's a 1 in 100 year. But when we were in modeling Sindh province, we also looked at 1 in 10 year and 1 in 100 years. So there was like an extra dimension. So yes, you could look at that what if scenario. So what if my defenses are already built? How much is it going to change the risk?
Thank you. And how are dams considered in the assessment? A question from Sarvesh Jain.
We looked at those. We didn't look at national scale reservoir failure in NERA, but when we did the prioritization scheme, we did have information from the Indonesian government on, it was more asset data on where the large dams were, and we considered that as when we were weighing up all the information. So again, you could sort of weigh that in.
Thank you, Barry. There is a question from Dr. Lutfur Rahman. How can integrated flood risk management become more sustainable?
Really good question. In fact, it's something we'll get into in our next session, which is next week. I mean, sustainability is the objective of IFRM. I mean, so what do we mean by IFRM? IFRM is a more integrated approach, a risk management approach. We're trying to bring in, say, perhaps traditionally, the approach to flood management might just be focused on infrastructure, building a dam or a levee or a dike or something like that. The integrated risk management approach is to take into more factors. And so it can be, whether we're talking about nature-based solutions or softer measures for reducing vulnerability or reducing exposure and so on. So how can IFRM become more sustainable? I guess sustainability is the goal of IFRM. And so it's a process, and it's an approach that leads in the direction more of sustainability than perhaps a traditional infrastructure-oriented only approach.
Could I add something? One of the last sort of series of sessions we did, we did start trying to weigh things up in terms of natural capital, so that can help as well, because then it provides the additional ecosystem service benefits of habitat or carbon and so on. So in our tool, we've tried to look at different metrics: average annual losses, average annual people at risk. The next natural one to put in there would be a natural capital.
Thank you. There is a question from Luis. Does NERA tools works for a country with regional autonomy, where each city regency have their own authority to decide their financial expenditure, so not decided by national authority? And can it work in the smaller scale or subnational level? Ian, would you like to answer this one?
I guess the strength of NERA is using these global data sets. I mean, as Barry has said, it's the engine of NERA looks at flood model simulations, which are conducted at a very broad level. So it's not the same as doing a flood study where you're out there surveying the river and checking things and spending weeks and months developing a model and applying it. So it applies a methodology that really relies on this globally available data. It's calibrated or verified at a large scale. So the purpose of it is to provide this top-down view across a whole region, and to be able to compare one region from another with a balanced and consistent data set. So is it good for doing your flood study in the small river beside your house? No, it's not as good as, it's not going to replace that. That's really not what the tool's for. So can it decide the financial or guide the financial expenditure within a smaller scale area? To the extent that it does. I mean, the resolution is 30 meters. So you could look at an area that's a few hundred kilometers across or within a province or district, and get some idea to compare one area within it from another. So yes, it would give you some indication of where the hotspot areas, where the critical areas are, but it won't give you the final answer. And so the final answer would come from a more detailed study and investigation, in which you'd look then with detailed survey or a more conventional modeling approach to really come up with a better answer. Is that fair, Barry?
Yes, that sounds exactly right. I was going to say that the finest scale that we tend to look at is typically called admin 3, so sort of sub-district. And we don't like to go smaller scale than that with these tools, because we start losing the resolution, even though we're using 30-meter resolution hazard grids. When you integrate up the risk, you need to do some averaging and so on. And so it will typically, in Indonesia, is at the catchment scale, so sub-district scale. And that's
Thank you,
the
Ian
kind of finest scale.
and Barry. Thank you both. Unfortunately, we are running out of time, so we are going to leave it here with the questions. But you can submit your questions, more questions via the event site. Barry, would you mind putting the last slide, please? Yes.
Is this one?
Yes, thank you. All the recordings and material will be in this event site, and you can also submit questions via there. We can get back to you. And I would like now to invite Ian for any closing remarks of the event.
Lorena, I guess the objective for the presentation was really to introduce this top-down approach to looking at flood risk issues. Through the work of Tony, we were able to look at this comparison between countries and get a feel for flood risk as a sector. How does it compare with other sectors? How does it compare with its expenditure relative to GDP for a country, and the some metric of the annual average loss? And so that's useful for us to, from say the point of view of ADB or national level, looking at have we got the balance right for expenditure and flooding. And then the presentation from Barry looks really further down, from country down to regional and river basin level. And I think that's generated a lot of discussion and a lot of interest as well. So we feel like we've at least opened the door and introduced some of the tools and the applications of these global sets of information that are becoming available. And so that has really been our purpose. So from that, next week on Tuesday, we'll go into this a bit more detail. So the question that we looked at today is where the issues are, where is the higher flood risk. We'll go more into what to do next week. And so we're talking about IFRM as a process. What are the issues? What are the constraints? What are the practical ways to apply IFRM at a river basin level? And we'll use some examples of that as well. So please join us. That's next week on 15th at 4 p.m. Manila time again. I'll be talking as well as my colleague Ian Munt, who's an urban planning specialist. So please join us for those. Back to you, Lorena.
Thank you everyone for joining us today, and we hope to see you in next session next week. Goodbye.
Thanks, guys.